Slam poetry.
He doesn't care if it's perfect.
It's time to slam now.
It's the biggest poem I've got inside of me.
She was a thief. You run
To love means to love a haunted house.
Yelling, angry.
Blood-black nothingness began to spin.
Specific point of view on
To
things.
this day, I hate pork chops.
I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
We're taking the world by storm. It's I Think Therefore I Slam. My name is Andrew, and when I say world, I mean it. We are well and truly pulling the camera lens out today. Since I started this thing, I always said that this was a podcast featuring the best spoken word and slam poetry artists from Melbourne and beyond. Well, we're going to have to change that. It's going to have to be Australia and beyond, because I'm very lucky to be joined by my very first international guest. My guest today hails from Montreal, Canada, of course, the land of maple syrup and Ryan Reynolds and Marianas Trench and I don't know, Carly Rae Jepsen. I could go on. As an English teacher and spoken word poet, my guest plays with stories in the classroom and at the mic. She is a community and self-taught narrative poet whose work cradles tales of her past self, family, Italian heritage, chronic illness, and love. My guest is a recipient of the 2022 Quebec Writers Federation Spoken Word Prize, a two-time Canadian Individual Poetry Slam finalist, and a member of the 2023 Throw Poetry Collective Slam team. In June 2023, my guest performed at the first Accenti Magazine International Festival of the Arts in Italy. Lucia de Luca, this is your very first podcast. You're my very first international guest. Welcome on. Such an honor to have you on.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. A lot of firsts for both of us.
Yes, absolutely. And I forgot to mention in your intro that you are also doing a little bit of a speaking circuit on the east coast of Australia. You're coming to the end of that. How's it all been?
It's been wonderful. Yeah, I started in Canberra, then went to Wollongong, then Melbourne, then Launceston, and I'm ending here in Sydney.
There you go. They always treat us on the east coast pretty nicely. Sometimes those western states, they miss out because they're so far away.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're going to talk more about your time in Australia a little bit later on. But first, I'm really excited to hear more of your work, Lu-CHEE-a. So you're going to start with your first piece. Is there anything you wanted to intro it with today, or did you want to dive right in?
I can dive right in. Funny enough, it mentions Marianas Trench somewhere in there. So
no
it
way.
lines up with your intro. Yeah, it does.
Oh, I'm a big fan. Yeah.
Yeah, so is my sister when she was younger, and it's a nostalgic poem. So it goes into, it talks about my family. I wrote this poem because a poet that was mentoring me, Ian Ketaku, who's a big poet out in Canada, asked me to write a poem that I'd been putting on hold or putting off, something along those lines. And I had been trying but not finishing to write a poem about my first car. And so this is that poem. It's called Stalling. 223,478 kilometers. The last day of first grade. Our maroon minivan doesn't stall, doesn't screech for a fix, like she doesn't know that her engine is graying, that her shock frame doesn't soften any blows, or that she's doubling as a glass case for our family of four for the final time. When we reach our local Honda dealership, my eyes spill the guilt of giving up the closest thing we know to a family pet. I mean, her back door, still warm with the problems of her last family, hesitates in its track before letting out my sister and I. 0 kilometers. Our new Honda Accord stands at the top of a staircase in a ball gown, already living a Cinderella story. With AC, a sunroof, and a tiara of untouched charcoal paint, she is Princeton girl. To our minivan's diner girl energy. Still, I don't trust her to take us home. She's never done it before. 71,763 kilometers. When my sister slides to the middle to make room for our new brother, I'm sure our car is the one to take him home. Like gimp bracelets, my parents' hands are a box knot between the front seats. Plastic threads looped together on cruise control, but forming corners at every layer. 92,159 kilometers. My sister listens to Marianas Trench on her MP3. My brother plays Fruit Ninja on my iPod. Dad grips the steering wheel, hands in her lap. Mom looks out the passenger window. Plastic turns to tangled vines, squirming in opposite directions. 114,361 kilometers. Her elbows scraped from bike handles and knees from shopping carts. Dad kicks back in the passenger seat. Even as I get too close to a pole, or merge awkwardly, or count to 3 at a stop sign while the car behind us grows impatient. 135,765 kilometers. 11th grade. Dad picks me up early from school. The snow holds off. I don't know the town where I take my driving test. There are too many one-way streets. The Accord and me pass, but Dad drives us home. To spaces we cannot reverse out of. An already failed test. 144,322 kilometers. Can I drive her? I'm taking her to work. Can I drive her? It's icy. Can I drive her? Okay, be safe. 165,697 kilometers. With dry vines a nuisance beneath my parents' feet. Our family car outlives our family. The Accord becomes a detour in mediation. Who owns her? What's she worth? Less financially destructive to give her to me than pay lawyers to decide. Dad teaches me to pop her hood and replace her leaky fluid. I'd buy her for $1. 171,318 kilometers. When we're cold, we run late. We need our windows scraped from the inside too. In Drive, we harmonize as we belt Adele's Hello. She's the only device I have left that plays CDs, and she does it well, storing 6 at a time. In Leaving, she makes me lock each of her doors manually, 2 kisses on each cheek before jogging into work. I name her Lucia Jr. 173,499 kilometers. Almost upgrade to a Mazda 3. Almost let someone else decide whether to euthanize her or sell her to a new family. 175,811 kilometers. Lucia Jr. punishes me for my betrayal. Her steering announces retirement. Her muffler screams for mercy. She stalls on an incline at a busy intersection while a long line of traffic swears and honks every time she brakes. I take responsibility for her stitches. Fixing her is my version of stalling. Is tree pose without conscious breath. Hoards what my family used to look like by keeping just the box. She is clutter, not heirloom. I need to villainize her or I won't give her up. 187,013 kilometers. Upon inspection, my mechanic finds 7 new things wrong with Lucia Jr. A few days later, I scratch her left side against a yellow pole in the parking garage of the building she moved me into. More yellow than charcoal. The trim comes off her back door. I keep it in the trunk of my new car.
Wow, that was something special. Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you.
What a fantastic way to tell like a wider story through a car. Lots of people talk about their connection with vehicles. I'm not necessarily someone that shares that, but it's funny what we can connect to and how it can tell a wider story. I thought it was so interesting that you said this came from a prompt from your mentor about writing a piece that you had been putting off. Can you tell us more about this piece and like, why do you think you were putting this one off?
Oof. That's such a good question. It's not that I was putting off writing it, it's that I was putting off finishing it.
Yeah.
It had gone through so many rewrites, and I think I was writing it while I still had this car. And by this point, the car was like getting close to 20 years old, which in Canada is a really long time because of our weather. And so I knew I was going to have to give it up. And I think I wanted a piece that did it justice and commemorated it properly before I had to. And so knowing that I was going to have to be the one to pull the plug, so to speak, on what was a family car and became just my car, I think that's what was difficult. And that's what I was trying to process in this piece. And I didn't really know how to finish it because I wanted to do it properly. Yeah.
Have you ever found that same kind of emotional connection with any car since, or is it special, that one?
No. My new car, I still don't like it. I just feel like I don't have the same field of vision in it. I don't have that connection to it at all. I think that whenever it's time to give that car up, it will be a very different experience, but it doesn't have this deep connection to feeling like it's part of my family.
Mm. Yeah, so true. I did relate a lot to you talking about the 6 CD stacker as well. As someone who still very much likes my physical media and my car is full of CDs, I feel like I'm going to hang on to that for a long time. I'll get one like retroactively fitted to my future car if I need to.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The original version of this poem ended earlier. It ended at, I need to villainize her or I won't give her up, because I still had the car when I thought the poem was finished. And if you look online, there is an older version that ends there. But I ended that last part about giving up my car and finding 7 new things wrong with it and all of that afterwards. So it just goes to show that sometimes you think the story is over, but it's not.
Mm. And this particular piece, Stalling, it was called, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I've read that this was a piece that got you into the final of the 2023 Ian Ferrier Spoken Word Prize. Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us more about what that prize is and how that works.
Yeah, so it's a prize run by the Quebec Writers Federation. In its first year, it was named the Quebec Writers Federation Spoken Word Prize. So it was the same prize I won the year before, but just under a different name. And how it works is you record a video of you performing a piece and you submit it. What makes that prize interesting is that it's open to all types of spoken word artists, so not just poets. So like comedians could apply, storytellers, anyone who writes to speak could apply for it. And it was the first time I had ever won anything in spoken word. And I think it set off like a different trajectory in my career, because I saw myself as more of a professional because other people did or saw that potential in me.
Yeah.
But I didn't really win a lot of slams. Like I've won 1 slam in my entire life. Like I've ranked, but winning only once. And I actually won this award before I ever won a slam. And I think it's because it's open to all types of spoken word artists. And even though I identify the most as a spoken word poet, I think I'm somewhere between a storyteller and a poet. And so I think it was easier to be recognized in an award that was a bit more open.
That's cool that it's a recording. It's not a live kind of performance. So it would lend a little bit of a different flavor to it, I think.
You could submit a video of you performing live. So it was very open in terms of what kinds of submissions they took in. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you for opening the account with that piece. That was really wonderful. I want to take us back to the beginning of your journey as a spoken word artist. How did you get involved in storytelling and having the boldness that so many people are after in this world to write your stories and share them so creatively?
So it all started when I was in grade 10, or as you guys say here, year 10, if I'm getting the lingo correct.
Right. Yeah, well done.
And it's funny, the poem that got me started, I heard it in the intro of your podcast. It was Shane Koizan's To This Day.
Yeah.
Shane's To This Day. Yeah.
The pork chops one. Yes.
The pork chops one, exactly. And
that
I heard
huge online. Yeah.
Yes. And it's rare for spoken word to be that big, but it's so good because I think it introduced a lot of people to spoken word. And I was listening to it and I was like, I could do this. And then I found other spoken word poets online like Sarah Kay and Phil Kay and all of those kind of mothers and fathers of spoken words, so to speak. And I just thought I could do this. And at my school, in the program I was in like the IBO program, which exists in different places in the world. And to graduate from that program, or to graduate with a certificate in that program, you have to complete something called a personal project. And it's just a project about whatever you want, and you set the parameters for that project. And so I decided I was going to create a spoken word album.
Whoa.
And I have not listened to it since. I don't think it was very good. I don't know where it is, but if I found it, I would probably burn it or hide it or something. But that's what got me started. And then the next year in grade 11, I auditioned for the variety show to perform spoken word. And I actually auditioned not even with my own poem. I auditioned with Sarah Kay's Point B, or also known as If I Should Have a Daughter.
Amazing.
So I just memorized her poem and was like, I'll just perform someone else's poem. I'm too afraid to perform my own words. And once I was chosen to be the variety show after I auditioned, I just changed my mind and decided I would perform my own work. And the poem that I wrote and performed for that variety show, I'm not sure if I remember what it was called, but it was from the perspective of a mirror. So even still, I was choosing to not speak in my own voice. I was choosing to speak from the perspective of a mirror, but still got me on stage, and it's still a piece that I was very proud of. And the variety show was 2 nights. And on the first night, despite the fact that I'd rehearsed for hours and hours for weeks and weeks, because there were, I don't know, probably somewhere between 200 and 250 people, and I was so nervous, I still forgot the words.
Oh.
So about midway through my poem, I just froze, stopped, was stumbling over a couple of lines, and just paused for what felt like an eternity, but was probably more like 10 or 15 seconds.
Yeah, no one knew.
And then kept going, and then got a standing ovation at the end of it, and then got back up on stage the next night. So it's interesting to look back on and think I could have just stopped. Like I could have run off stage crying and upset, but what could have been a moment that totally tore me apart actually ended up being quite empowering and made me keep going.
And you said this was for a variety show. Was this just within your high school, or was this a larger kind of thing?
It was just within my high school.
Yeah, amazing. And when you said there were like 250 people, I thought for a second you might have meant 250 acts rather than 250 in the audience.
No. Yeah, people. So like students, parents,
Yeah.
teachers, community members.
And what did that feel like, getting a standing ovation from your peers? Because we've already talked about like receiving recognition from other people in terms of winning these awards or making it to finals. That recognition of like, hey, you've got it going on, Lucia.
I think it came at a time where I was really craving recognition.
Yep.
So I'm sure I appreciated it. I think I especially appreciated it because I messed up, and it taught me that you can mess up and your audience might not care if you're still willing to keep going and you're willing to pick yourself back up, and if you treat it as a small thing, then your audience will also treat that moment as a small thing. And because I'm a teacher, I've sometimes tell that story, or at least tell the lesson from that story, to my students when we're doing public speaking.
Yeah.
Because I find one of their worst fears that's getting in their way when they're speaking in front of their classmates is that fear of messing up or forgetting. And I'm like, you realize people won't care that much if you act like you don't care that much. If you stumble over a word and you just keep going, I will probably forget about it by the time I calculate your grade. Your classmates or your peers don't really care that much unless you make it a big deal. And I know that because I had that experience.
I think that's fantastic advice. It's almost like when you're a little kid and, I don't know, you fall over, you scrape your knee, and you look around at maybe all the adults that are around you and you take your emotional cues from them. Like if they act like it's a big deal, you might cry. But if they just carry on, sometimes you see kids just be really resilient and carry on. So I think that's really important to, if you fall over on stage, metaphorically or literally, to just keep going. Tell us more about your experience in teaching, because we have many guests on this show already that have that dimension to them in all kinds of different contexts. So how do you find being an English teacher and balancing that with your clear love of words and storytelling?
Yeah, there are aspects of it that I absolutely love. I think there are some teachers that sign up for teaching and they could teach any subject or teach multiple subjects and be happy with it or be happy enough with it. I went into teaching, I would say 50% because I wanted to teach young people, specifically teenagers, and 50% because I wanted to immerse myself in stories and writing all day. So for me, the subject that I am teaching is such an important part of why I'm doing it and such an important part of my identity and my career. And so I enjoy that part of things. Because I'm in the French province in Canada, but teaching English as a first language, I think it's an interesting place to be teaching English.
Yeah.
But one of the perks of it is that I think there's a little bit more freedom in how you do it. So I like that part. I like the creative element of choosing how I navigate the curriculum, because the curriculum is more of a list of goals and
Mm.
more of a list of
Standards.
abilities that a student
Yeah.
should, yeah, standards and abilities that a student should reach,
Mm.
and less so the specific stories that they have to read or the
Mm.
specific assignments that they have to complete to get there. So I like that part of things. I think for me, the part that I find most challenging with teaching is that it becomes all consuming, and I don't want to be all consumed by it.
Yeah.
And some teachers are okay with that, or at least if they're not okay with that, there's been a history of like that's just part of the job. And I don't necessarily appreciate that as part of the job because I want to be able to do other things when I get home, like write my own poetry.
Mm.
And I start getting a little bit upset with my career choice when it starts to take away from other things that I want to be doing as well, or other things that I care about.
Oh, wow. That's very honest of you. As someone who comes from a family with many teachers in it and many former teachers, when I hear that a friend of mine is interested in teaching, I do wish them all the best. But if they say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go into teaching because you get the 10 weeks off during the year, I go, okay, yep, maybe not the first reason why you might want to do it. When you were a student, like, did you have teachers in your life that inspired you to pursue that career?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to be a teacher since I was in grade 1.
Oh, amazing.
So I'd say I've had a lot of teachers that I looked up to, and I would say who I am as a teacher is a mix of parts of many different teachers that I've had.
Yeah. Speaking of people that inspire us, you name dropped a few big names in Canadian spoken word. So you were talking about Shane Koizan, and I remember us having a conversation beforehand about his performance at the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics. You were saying that you didn't quite recall a lot of it, but as soon as I told my Canadian co-worker that you were coming on the show, they said, oh, have you heard of Shane and what he did all those years ago? And Sarah Kay, her TED Talk around her poetry has gone viral as well. I think you put the words, the mothers and fathers of slam. Australia, I feel, is very young in slam. I don't think, from what I can see, we didn't really have like a national prize or competition until about 2008. So what is the flavor or what is the feel of slam poetry in Canada?
Oh, that's a hard question because even though maybe our history is a little bit older, my history in it is not necessarily that
Sure.
old. I don't know how to answer the question. What is the flavor of spoken word in Canada? That was the question.
Yeah, maybe
Uh,
let's reframe it. So, what does your involvement in spoken word look like week to week? Obviously, you're juggling everything else in your life. How common is it to go into a city, and are there a lot of groups running, or is it fairly isolated and spread out? What's it like?
Okay, so comparing the cities that I've visited in Australia to the cities that I visited in Canada, which there are many cities in both of these countries that I've not been to.
Mm.
Australia, particularly places like Melbourne, seem to have more frequent events.
Oh.
Like you can find them more easily and more often. In Canada, from what I can tell, and maybe someone's experience is different, and I would love to know more about that. We have a lot of long-running poetry events, but they're more like monthly.
Yeah, okay.
So there could be a whole week or two or multiple where if you wanted to go to a poetry event, there might not be one. But also, I feel like I could be wrong because a lot of my focus in the last little while has been on going to slams. So I'm thinking of this as specifically slam related, so competition based. But more recently, I've been looking into different open mics are around. So I feel like I do have a lot more to discover. Like there might be things that happen more frequently that I just haven't been having my focus on it. I competed in slams on and off, very on and off, for about 9 years. And I recently quit slam like in April. So I feel like maybe my perspective of the Canadian poetry scene is a little bit, it might be skewed. I don't know if I'm the right person to be asking this question to, honestly.
That's
Yeah.
okay. That's okay. I'm just interested in what you think. I'm not asking you saying,
Yeah.
"Oh, Lucia, you have to be the mouthpiece of your entire country." That's not what I'm going for. I'm not someone who's well traveled, so to speak, Lucia. So I'm just interested in people's perspectives and where they come from.
Yeah.
You said that you quit slam. Is that right?
Yeah, in April.
Oh, okay. What kind of led to that decision? Just life stuff?
A few different things.
Okay.
My relationship to it had changed. Like when I first started doing slams, I didn't care as much about the results. Like I cared about doing well and about presenting something that was good and that I had put a lot of effort into, but I didn't care as much about the scores. I didn't get very caught up in them. I didn't like lose sleep over them, but I also didn't see poetry as a career. So I think I didn't feel that pressure. And then as time went on and I started getting better at it and I started ranking higher in slams or just getting a little bit more recognition, then I really started to care about the scores. So it's like when other people maybe recognized me a little bit more, then I felt a little bit more pressure to do well. And I felt like when I was rehearsing my pieces, I would have performances that were like up here and they were bigger. By bigger, I don't necessarily mean louder, but just there were a lot of performance strategies that I had intertwined into how I rehearsed them that on stage, they existed, but on such a much more minor scale that they were almost invisible. Like when I would watch videos of myself, I didn't see all the things I had practiced come across as clearly as I would have liked. And I think it's because one of my coping strategies when I am stressed is to really calm myself down. But at this point, I was calming myself down to a point where I couldn't show as much personality as I would have liked. And then the other piece of it is that I have a chronic illness and it's stress induced. And I was just feeling that slams were, even though they didn't used to have that effect on me, were having this effect on me that they were literally making me sick. And I didn't want to do it anymore. And a part of me was frustrated that this wasn't the association that I used to have with slam. I didn't used to stress myself out over it or feel ill over it, but this is where I was at, and I had to trust that this was my body encouraging me to approach spoken word in different ways and not just in a competitive aspect. And that part of it, I can thank it for, because now I can look for opportunities that I wouldn't have looked for otherwise, like performing in different places in Australia or just sending out more expressions of interest to different people, because I'm not just showing up and signing myself up to compete. So I have to show up in other ways. And I think ultimately that will offer a lot of growth for me.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's so admirable, Lucia, that you were receptive to what your needs were at the time. I think I've shared this on the show before, but I know all too well, like I'm a competitive guy, and I know all too well, like how easy it is to get wrapped up in the competitive elements of some of the spoken word scene. This whole show grew out of me trying to get beyond that a bit. Not that I'm not doing slams or whatever, but just taking a wider lens and going, hey, is this something that I am going to turn into like a tool that I use to dominate other people or try and dominate them? Or is this going to be something wider that becomes about generosity, the generosity of listening to other people and sharing my perspective? So no, I just really commend you for making that call. I'm sure it was a difficult call, but hey, if it's what you need and if it opens up new doors and new opportunities, then it sounds like it's absolutely the right move.
That's it. I didn't want to keep feeling like I was in competition with people who should feel like peers, potential collaborators.
Yes.
I also wanted to go back into the role of remembering that I can also be an audience member, which when you're like stressed about going up and you're thinking about yourself and putting yourself on stage and how people are going to perceive you, then it makes it more difficult to enjoy the other performances that are going on, because you're not thinking of them as collaborators in an event or a show. You're thinking about them as your competition, which is not what other artists should be. And I used to be able to do this, and I think many poets still can. You can show up to these competitions, to these slams, and still have that perspective of like, this is a collaborative effort. We are sharing the stage together. But I think I needed to take a step back from that to remember it.
Oh, wow. You took the words right out of my mouth, Lucia. Yeah, absolutely. You're barely listening when you sometimes when you're getting ready to go on stage. You're just like, when's my cue? When's my
Yeah.
cue? I'd love to know more about your experience at the Accenti Magazine International Festival of the Arts in Italy. It sounds very bougie, as we say over here. And I know that you yourself are Italian. So what was this festival about?
Yeah, so Accenti Magazine is an Italian Canadian magazine that runs out of Montreal.
Hmm.
And like I've followed them online and have followed their work for a while, especially like you said, since I'm Italian Canadian, this was a group that I very much identified with.
Hmm.
And when I saw that they had put a call out for people that wanted to participate in their festival, I really liked the idea of this. I liked the idea of potentially being able to go somewhere and perform my poetry, but be in a space where not everyone was a poet,
Hmm.
right? So this came at a time where I maybe didn't realize yet that I needed to take a step back from slam, but this was probably along those same lines. They were calling out for work that looked at Italian identity or Italian Canadian identity, and I have a number of poems on that topic, but I felt like I didn't have enough to fill the time slot they were allotting for. And so I reached out to another Italian Canadian poet from Montreal, Liana Cusmano, and asked them if they were interested in collaborating. I didn't realize that their parents were the founders of Accenti Magazine at
Oh,
the time, but I had heard Liana perform at our local slam many times before, and they're excellent. And so that was a wonderful opportunity to collaborate and just be around a lot of Italian Canadians, but also just people who were part of the Italian diaspora from around the world, because it wasn't just Italian Canadians there, and see people talk about their Italian heritage and experience through all different forms of art or experiences, or even some like research. And Leanna and I got to share that through poetry.
so good. Sounds amazing. You'd said to me that you'd been to Italy before on a school trip, but this was your first time where I guess you really got to spread your wings and do your own thing. So being in Italy amongst your culture, like what did that mean to you?
Oh, it was so special. It was special to be around other people who could understand what it's like to have an Italian experience outside of Italy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I definitely just felt more deeply, yeah, connected. My grandmother, before she passed away, had Alzheimer's for quite a few years. And I feel like she was my last strongest connection
Mm.
to being Italian, because she was like one of the last people who I was still speaking Italian with on a somewhat regular basis. And yeah, just as she got sicker, it was more difficult to have conversations with her. And so I was a little bit more out of practice. So I think, yeah, being able to have that connection somewhere else and still
Mm.
feel that familiarity with people who weren't necessarily familiar came at a good time. And what's interesting is that on one of my last days of the trip, my dad messaged me, and he was like confirming when I was going to be coming home, because my grandmother was in the hospital and she was going to be passing away.
Oh, wow.
So I came back from that trip where I was like, where she came from, where she immigrated
Mm.
from. And then she passed away less than 2 weeks after that.
Oh, wow. The timing of it was uncanny in a way. I guess it all tied together in a very sad, but I guess a very special way for you.
It was
So,
a way to feel
yeah.
more connected to her
Yeah.
right before she passed. And one of the poems I performed at the Accenti Festival was a poem about her, and was a poem about the process of repeatedly having to say goodbye to someone with Alzheimer's, because you're not saying goodbye to them, you're saying goodbye to them in stages. And yeah, so it was interesting to perform that poem about repeatedly having to say goodbye and then having to say a final goodbye shortly after.
Yeah, wow. So from Canada to Italy, now you're currently in Australia. You're doing this kind of East Coast performing circuit. We're not going to call it a tour. You've told me that it's not technically classified as a tour. We'll say performing circuit.
No.
You were saying to me that this is not your first time in Australia, that you were studying over here for a time a few years ago. Tell us what's been some of the highlights of the tour, and what have you been able to see in some of the events that you've been a part of while you're over here?
I was an exchange student. You had it right. I was an
Oh,
exchange
okay.
student here 5 years ago. Maybe I'll start with that and then I'll
Yeah.
get into the second part of your question where you
Absolutely. Yeah. What was it like first time around? Yeah.
it was great. It wasn't the first time I had been to Australia
Yeah.
because I'm currently in my aunt's house, so I've been like periodically over the course of my life. But that was the time where I had spent like the longest stretch here because I was here for a semester. And while I was here, I was an intern at Word Travels. So I was exposed to a lot of the Australian poetry scene.
Yes.
And this was at a time where I was still writing and performing poetry, but not very consistently at all. And I think seeing how seriously some people take it here, which is not to say that people don't take it seriously in Canada, it's just that I had never found myself in an office surrounded by these types of people or at events surrounded by these types of people as much. But yeah, being surrounded by people treating poetry as a career kind of switched a light bulb off in my head, or on in my head, I should say. And I only got the courage to get on a microphone here in like the last couple of weeks that I was in Australia. And it was the first time I had placed, like I came second, and that was the highest ranking I had ever had in a slam. And so, yeah, it changed something in me to keep up with it and just take it more seriously. And it was also the first time, because of the poets I had seen in Australia and because of how I had seen them also not just perform their poetry, but talk about their poetry, that I saw that poetry could also be a form of storytelling. And I think that's why I started to do better in slam, because I think the approach of storytelling is more authentic to who I am. Even when I was in elementary school, my teacher told me that I write best when I write stories that are true, that are personal to me. And I think that has continued to be true for me. So when I took the approach of storytelling rather than more abstract poetry, that's when I found myself the most in poetry and was able to write in a way that was where I could truly be myself and present myself in the most honest way possible. And so when I came back home after having this experience, my approach to poetry was just different. And I just felt more encouraged to show up and perform as often as I could. I had the goal when I got back that I would perform either at a slam or an open mic at least once a month. And I stuck with that until the pandemic started and it became a little bit more difficult. But the second part of your question was, what have I seen out here this time around, right?
Yes.
My favorite thing that I've seen this time around is the other poets. Like, it goes back to what we were talking about before, because I'm not competing while I'm here and I'm specifically featuring at open mics and slams, I get to see other poets perform and actually hear what they're saying and actually enjoy what they're saying and be inspired by them. And I've ended all my features saying that I didn't just come all the way out here to share my own work. I also came here so that I could hear poets that were new to me perform. And that has been the best part. I get to be an audience member. I get to be part of the audience, and that is just so cool.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What a great experience. That's so cool to hear that when you were here doing your internship and everything, that you were able to take something really tangible back with you to incorporate into your own craft and your own approach in Canadian slams, in Canadian open mics. I think there's a real spirit of generosity in the Australian scene. I think when we do it well, like, we're not perfect, but I think when we do it well, we can throw a pretty mean slam poetry night. So while you've been over here, you've hit up Canberra, you've hit up Wollongong, you have been down my way, down in Melbourne, Launceston as well, which is cool. I'm not super familiar with what's happening down in Tasmania. And you've got your final engagement in Sydney at Westside Poetry Slam. Now, I'm going to ask a couple of funny touristy questions here. So I've got to ask you, Lucia, Vegemite, thumbs up or thumbs down?
So I have a gluten intolerance, so I've not tried Vegemite.
Definitely a thumbs down then. I don't know if there is a gluten-free variety or whether there's enough market pressure for that.
I don't think so, yeah.
If there was a gluten-free variety, would you be open to trying it or steering clear?
I would try it because I've smelt it. I have a strong sense that it's probably not for me.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Well, it's not for me either, Lucia. I'm not a fan actually, so I'm going to cop some criticism for that. Maybe. Have you had the opportunity to pet or to get up close and personal with a koala or a kangaroo or any of our weird native animals while you've been over here?
Yeah, we went to Featherdale Wildlife Park, which
Ooh.
is near Sydney, or
Yeah.
I don't know if it's technically in Sydney or in the greater Sydney area. I don't know how you guys call geographically
Yeah.
spread things out here. But yeah, we went to that wildlife park and I was able to pet a wallaby and see some kangaroos and see some koalas and all kinds of other animals that you've had here. But last time I was here, I went to a wildlife park in Brisbane. I don't remember what it was called. And there I was really able to get up and close with some kangaroos.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a fan.
I'm trying to think of a third question, but it'd probably be something like, oh, have you done a shoey while you're over here? Do you know what that is?
No, it's a shoey.
I'm just having a bit of a joke, but sometimes
Okay.
certain Australian sportsmen, if they win, say I think some F1 drivers, if they win a race, they will drink a beer out of their shoe, which is about as disgusting as it sounds.
Oh, yeah, not
None of
for
that.
me.
None of that. Yeah, it's only a
No.
tradition in some circles. I don't know. You'd have a hard time getting me to do a shoey.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think we're very lucky to have you over here, Lucia. So it's really great when people from other countries take an interest in coming and sharing their work and giving a different angle. I think we'd all love to hear your second piece, Lucia. Did you want to launch in or give a bit of preamble?
Yeah, I could. I feel like I maybe accidentally gave a bit of preamble before when I was talking
Ooh.
about my grandmother.
That's okay.
This is not the poem that I performed at the festival last year, but it's a poem that I actually started writing it as she was passing away because poetry, like for many of us, is one of the ways I cope and process and grieve. And then, yeah, so started writing it while she was passing away and finished it a little while afterwards. I'm from the French part of Canada, so Montreal is a city in the province of Quebec, which is the only province in Canada where French is considered the first language. And so there's some language tension where I'm from between sort of our province and the rest of Canada, which is predominantly English. There's also some tension, I'm going to say particularly with like the French government and not the French government, but like the current government who is also predominantly French and the English speaking minority, which I am part of in my province. But on top of this kind of language tension that is more political, I have my own internal language tension because my first language wasn't English or French. So like this debate of which language is more important is not as relevant to me. I know you guys also have a similar history here in Australia where because of colonization, English is also not the first language of Australia. So there's that whole other element of things where English and French are not even the first languages of Canada. There were many indigenous languages present before either of those ever came to be in North America. But on top of that, my first language was Italian. And as my vocabulary evolved in English and in French, so as I went through elementary school especially, I lost a lot of my Italian, which was the language I was most fluent in for most of like my early years.
Yeah.
And it's a complicated thing to no longer be fluent in the language that you thought your first thoughts in or spoke your first words in. But I think one of the places it hurt me the most was that I was losing the ability to speak fluently to my grandmother, who was only ever fluent in Italian. So this touches on a little bit of that. It's called Congratulations. My Nonna Donata was born in winter, but grew wings in her 91st summer. While she died, her youngest grandchild turned 17, and the rabbit's nest in the rich soil of my mom's oregano patch pulsed. In the same inhale, I watched Nana's heart peek its ears from her shallow chest. At the hospital, an orderly asked, English or French? Italian, I answered, too late for either of them to share a language the way Nana distributed leftovers on a Sunday afternoon. made intentionally to sit in containers in our laps as we'd wave to her from the car. She'd stand at her window until we were completely out of sight. Grouped around her hospital bed, we broke silence by playing hot potato with light chit-chat. When dropped, we had nothing to throw and got caught in our labored breathing until someone picked up the conversation again, but always in English. It was so much easier to pass back and forth without hesitating and then ricocheting off the shin of an instinctiveless IV pole that was no longer attached to her wrist. Growing up, dinner conversations were like that one day a year in my elementary school where the maintenance worker and the phys ed teacher teamed up to throw lost tennis balls off the roof at recess time, only to have them immediately rebounded off the perpendicular brick wall by their victorious new owners. Growing up, we'd pause every so often to catch Nonna up on the conversation, and she never interrupted, even though she understood so little. But when she spoke to my parents, aunts, and uncles in Italian, just before plates were cleared, it was the youngest of us who fumbled as we tried to catch the words we lost but recognized, shot back with little aim, pleaded to know. What did Nonna say? When she died, the only way I entered her hospital room was by picturing a version of her before Alzheimer's. In her blue dress, with the white flowers, getting up from the dinner table to take my hand and stand beside me as I watched her still chest. The rabbit's nest in my mom's backyard had hatched, so it was still too. I let go of the hand I was imagining to pat her on her very real but lifeless shoulder. The hand I was imagining caught the hesitancy in my palm with accuracy and led me to the elevator. The Nonna I was imagining stood there until the doors were completely closed. Before reaching the ground floor, the elevator opened onto the maternity ward. A couple walked in with their newborn baby, grieving like a rooftop tennis ball, about to hit the schoolyard's concrete floor again. I looked from the tiny human that seemed bigger than Nonna was in her last moments, to their parents' smiling faces, fumbled to find the right word, lined it up in my mouth but landed with little aim, and said, "Congratulations."
Thank you, Lucia. What a beautiful piece. Just on a personal level, as someone who lost my last grandparent recently, thank you for giving some voice to that experience. I thought that was such a strong opening as well, like so full of intrigue and fantastic imagery. I'm really blown away by the craft of what you do and how you mentioned storytelling is your vibe. It's never unclear to me what is happening in the story, and yet you're able to embellish it with such interesting imagery and such interesting metaphor. And it's funny, I went to like a spoken word poetry workshop just at my local recently. And so it's full of people, some who've done it before, some who haven't. And the instructor was encouraging people to have clarity in what they say. As in, when you're writing on the page, you can use more kind of specific language, or you can be a bit more abstract. But it's really important, like when you're sharing with spoken word, to have clarity. And I think you've really got that. And it's funny, when I was listening to this instructor, I almost found myself disagreeing a bit, but that's more because my style is a little bit more abstract, because sometimes I'm trying to hide or veil what I mean in my pieces a bit. So I appreciate that you've taken the time to craft something that I feel like is accessible and beautiful. So thank you for that. Wow. I'd love to talk to you, Lucia, about the creative process and how you go about forming and shaping and editing and polishing pieces like the ones that you've done before. So we run the gamuts with my guests here, some who are extremely disciplined and have it all planned out, and others that kind of just, it happens when it happens, and that's what they find useful and beautiful. So where do you fall on that spectrum?
I lean much more heavily towards it happens when it happens.
Cool.
I can force editing more, but initially coming up with a poem I find really difficult.
Mm.
Yeah, like I'm not the type of person where you can just point to me and say, write a poem. I'm like, when life writes a poem, I will write it down. Like I will observe it and write it down. And you can see that in the poem I just did, where especially the parts where I was juxtaposing life and death, I was like, I cannot believe that as my grandmother is passing away and I'm focusing so much on her chest because she's so weak and quiet. That's one of the indicators that she's still alive. That at the same time I'm looking at this, I'm looking at the rabbit's nest in my mom's backyard that's also pulsing. And my mom is looking at it in anticipation of when it will hatch. And so both these things are pulsing, but heading in very different directions. And when life presents something like that to me, that's a poem, and I have to write it down because I was the one to witness it. So I guess I just wait to experience or witness something and write it down. I think a lot of my poetry kind of fits into a couple of categories. Either I'm commemorating or grieving something, like in the first two poems that I did, or I'm taking a time where I felt disempowered and I'm rewriting and reframing that instance in my life in a way where I could perform something that is empowering, where I get to regain main character energy, so to speak. And yeah, so I don't know I don't think I have a process, to be honest. I think it's just, I just live my life and am open to receiving poetry, and when I receive it, I make something out of it. As much as I wish my writing process was faster sometimes, because there is a little bit of a pressure to produce sometimes.
Sure.
And especially when you're performing, there's a little bit of pressure to not keep performing the same poems over and over again. I've just accepted that my process is long. Like there are some poems that have taken me well over a year to finish editing. And that's what that poem needed to be. That I didn't have the full story for that poem when I started writing it. And so it took a year for the whole story to unravel, and that's okay. Like you mentioned, everyone has different writing styles and different approaches, and that's what makes spoken word so interesting and beautiful. And if mine is storytelling, honest storytelling, then I have to go at the pace that the stories unravel, and it's not something I can force.
Yeah, I love how you said that you're open to receiving poetry, and that going through life with that receptivity, sometimes like that's more than enough. Things will just cross your paths, whether it's things in your life or things you hear. I try and listen to my gut a lot, and I try and think, ooh, why did this experience make me feel a certain way? Why does this make me angry? Why does this make me upset? Why does this make me so joyous and make me come to life? Do you know what I mean? So I'll share like one of my practices that I love doing is I love float tanks. I know I've talked about this before. So I've found it extremely helpful for my creativity, just being in a space where there's no sensory input. I'm in there for like an hour, and sometimes I'm in kind of that state between sleeping and waking almost. So maybe that's got something to do with it. I don't know. But I found that so helpful for creativity in terms of cutting off the overstimulation of life and just focusing on, I don't know, the landscape, feeling like I'm floating through the air. So is there anything in your life that helps you keep that receptivity, that helps you not close yourself off to some of the poetry and the stories that are happening around you?
I think what's most important to me is just to keep seeing life as new experiences, which can be hard, like if you have a routine, which I'm a teacher, so there's definitely an element of routine. This is definitely true because one of the hardest times for me to write was in lockdown, because I wasn't really having new experiences as much, or at least I didn't feel like I was. And so I was like, what stories am I supposed to tell? Like, there's no new story. Yeah, so I think for me, it's just keep having new experiences. If I feel like I'm in a routine, like try and notice what is new about it, because obviously every single day is a little bit different. Like, for example, one poem that I have opens up with an observation about some baby geese that I kept driving past on my way to work. And it's like if I kept just seeing it as this is my drive to work, it's the same thing every single day, then I wouldn't have had the opening lines to that poem. But because I was noticing what was going on around me and noticing the evolution of these baby geese, even though maybe my drive to work wasn't really evolving, things around me were, and there are still stories there.
Yeah. So I'm hearing, yeah, having that receptivity to like wonder and curiosity and yeah, not getting bogged down in the routine, as you said. A quick tangent. I'm interested to hear. So lockdown, as you mentioned, in Melbourne was a very singularly unique thing, as in it was very strict for a very long time. And was the kind of thing that maybe you mentioned having difficulty to write. I think a lot of people have been able to write from that space simply because it was quite extreme. And I think it brought a lot of emotions of fear, anger, etc. to the surface. What were those years or that time like where you were? How restricted were you? Or was it just kind of boredom? And so that's why there wasn't much writing happening because everything was just cancelled for a while.
Yeah, no, it was quite strict. Yeah,
Okay.
there weren't really like you had to stay home.
Yeah.
You could only go to very specific places for necessities. From what I've heard from talking to people here, I think it was probably comparable.
Yeah.
I think we were just in lockdowns at slightly different times because
Yeah, totally.
like we were in different countries, obviously, but I think probably had quite similar experiences. Yeah, I think I used that time more to perform what I had already written. Like I was going to a lot of online events. And so because I was having, it's not that I wasn't writing at all, it's just, it was just more challenging and I was writing much less. But yeah, I think I used that time to get my words that I had already written out there more than pressuring myself to produce things that weren't coming up for me.
Yeah, totally. There were so many instances of and it's understandable. There was always this cultural movement of people saying, what an opportunity to launch a business or learn how to make sourdough. That's the cliche. And that's great. Like if that brought you bliss or whatever, that's awesome. But it's so funny how sometimes we could take an idea that is good for a few and suddenly it becomes this cultural expectation of like, oh yeah, how did you better yourself over lockdown? And it's like, mate, there was no bettering of myself. It was just trying to get through it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. For me, I don't know if it necessarily bettered me as a writer, but I think it did better me as a performer. Like I don't think I got worse as a writer during it. I just think I wasn't getting as much practice because of my writing style and my writing process, if there even is one. But the first time I competed in the Canadian Individual Poetry Slam was in the pandemic online. And I thought, well, why not? I don't really have to take off time work because it's online. I can just go home at the end of the day, hop on Zoom, and I'm in Vancouver. So I think for things like that, for performing in different cities without having to worry about a work schedule or whatever else, it was a really cool thing. And it was a way for me to connect with poets I probably wouldn't have connected with and just approach spoken word in different ways. So I think that part was definitely a perk for me.
Oh, yeah. And I've spoken to people on the show who first found out about local events while everything was online because it was the place to be. And then they started attending once things opened back up. And I think I think the art scene locally is slowly starting to bounce back in terms of events and venues. We have seen a lot of music festivals struggling and whatever. So I do think it's still an interesting time for the arts, considering all the pressures that are going on. But we're getting there, and there's new things cropping up. Lu-CHEE-a, what about creative blocks? So you mentioned before about, correct me if I'm wrong, making like a collection of poetry when you were in high school, and you said that you don't know where that collection is, but if you found it, you would probably destroy it. I'm just wondering, like we talk a lot about feeling cringe sometimes and having sometimes a bit of a perfectionist streak about our work. Is that somewhat relatable to you? Do you sometimes feel like you just can't get it right sometimes?
I think perfectionism hits me more when I'm trying to decide whether or not a poem is finished. I think in the early stages of writing a poem, I couldn't care less. The number of times it just looks like a list or a paragraph or a series of paragraphs that I'm not even sure are connected yet. And it doesn't really start off as a poem, but I know that it's going to get there. So I don't know. I feel like I spend more time in a creative block than I do writing poetry because my process is so long. But I don't know. I'm not that upset about it. The only time I get frustrated with it is if I start to compare myself to others and I start looking at like, oh my gosh, they've produced so many new poems and I've only produced like a few recently. What does that mean about me as a poet? Does it mean I can even do this professionally? Can I even consider myself a professional if my process is slower? And then just starting to question yourself. So I think that's more when it hits me if I start comparing myself to other people. That's where the perfectionism comes in. Or like I said, at the end of a poem, trying to decide whether or not it's done. Especially, like I think we talk about editing a poem in terms of its writing a lot, but I think we also edit our performances. And I think that's also where a lot of perfectionism comes in, of just wanting to do it really well and in a way that's interesting and engaging to other people. So constantly like revisiting how I perform something. And that also extends my editing process because I consider it part of it. I don't know if I answered the question, but I don't know. I think I live in a creative block and I just wait for things to shine through it. And then when it does, I grab onto it very quickly.
Oh, yeah. If you're constantly in the inspiration zone, I imagine it would be hard to get anything else done. So sometimes we need to duck in and duck out, as it were. You mentioned working on one of your pieces for a year, but not necessarily being annoyed by that, but accepting of that. That is just part of it, and you can return to it and look at it in a loving way and go, what would happen if we did this? Or, okay, let's think about the ending here. I think that's a really positive way to look at it. I feel like if I was in that situation, and I guess I am, I do have pieces that have been reasonably fully formed, but I'm not happy with them. And I'm just like, I'm looking at it going, why aren't you what I want you to be? So maybe I could definitely use with softening the eyes a little bit and looking a bit more lovingly on them. And maybe then that'll help them complete. I don't know.
You will know when it's done. For me, it's less a matter of if it will be done and more of a matter of when. And you have to be open to the when, just not being soon sometimes.
Yeah, you'll know when it's done. That's really great wisdom. Lu-CHEE-a, I'm going to ask you our favorite question on the show here. Let me paint the scene for you. I want you to imagine you're going to like a dinner party, right? It's a spoken word dinner party. And we've talked about how sometimes everyone wants to be the person to bring the turkey. You know what I mean? Like the main thing that's going to fill everyone up, that's going to blow their hair back and really wow them. But if everyone's doing that, if everyone's bringing that same flavor, then that's too much turkey. It's too much turkey, TMT. So if your art and your work is a food at this dinner party, what kind of food do you think it is?
Yeah, so my answer is not going to be a simple one. I really thought about this question and I thought about like, what do I bring to dinner parties? And does it compare to my writing? And I think it does. I feel like a lot of my cooking is what's in the fridge cooking. Like, it's like, I don't know what it's going to be, but I'll open my fridge and I'll see what needs to be used. And it might turn into a curry or a soup or a casserole or I don't know what, a stir fry. But I think what I like to serve is a dish where someone asks me what was the recipe, I get to go, I don't know. Like I just opened my fridge and made what's in the fridge. Like that's what I would bring. What is in my fridge? And it goes back to how I write because I can't force myself to write something, but if there's inspiration there that pops up, I will work with it and I can work with it. So yeah, I'm often that person where if you ask me what was the recipe, my answer is I don't know. And if I do know, it's because I think what I'm coming up with is good. So I'm writing it down at the same time and I'll send you a picture of a sticky note that I wrote on. So I don't think I'm the person to bring the turkey. I think I'm the person that brings the random thing that kind of surprised you and you're like, what is this? And I don't even know the answer.
Yeah. And you think about that process of getting all the leftovers or whatever, like what you end up with, hopefully, is something that's more than the sum of its parts. Because some people, like, they throw leftovers out, they look at it and they go, oh, well, that's not good for anything. And it's just not true. Like, you just got to find what complements it. Do you know what I mean? I know we're stretching the metaphor a bit. I love how we're getting such a variety of dishes here. I think people have said cheese boards and frog in a pond and curries and things like this. So we're really going for it. We're really going for it. Everyone's bringing something different. I want to know what's next for you, Lucia. You're finishing up your gigs here in Australia very soon, but what do you think is next for you creatively in the next season?
There are so many ways I want to answer that question. Like, I want to give a list of things that I want to do, but also when I get back on a Monday and then that Friday, the school year starts.
Whoa.
Because we're on a different school calendar than in Australia. So our school year starts in September and teachers go in a few days before. So I start work the Friday after, and I'm sure a lot of teachers could relate. Those first few weeks or days are just more consuming. So while I'm excited about things that I have coming up, there's also that element of, can I balance it and can I achieve them to the level that I want to with the amount of time that I have? And I think that's what I talked about earlier about how teaching can be really all-consuming while you're in it. And even though you've got those couple months off a year where you have that freedom, it's like for 10 months, your primary focus had to be your job. But some things that I have coming up when I get back, I've got a few performances lined up that I booked through sending expressions of interest. And that's really important to me because instead of just signing up for an open mic or waiting for someone to reach out to me, especially since saying I've retired from slam, expressions of interest are definitely the way to go. Let other people know that you are available to work so that they can hire you. And then I don't have a book published or anything like that. And I think it'll be a while before I do because, like I said, it's just a long process for me to get those types of things done. But I have this dream that I'd like to make an interactive zine. So where it's partially my poems and partially a workbook. So again, meshing multiple aspects of who I am, being a poet, but also being a teacher. So I think, that'll be something a bit more crafty and exciting for me to do. Do I know when it will be done? No. Do I know that I've set my sights on doing it? Yes.
Yes. Well, as you said, you'll know when it's finished. So
Yeah.
That sounds amazing. It sounds like you've got a little bit of everything there. Obviously, you're going to be diving back into things with your students, but you've got some great ambitions and some really unique ambitions around how you can pass things on to the next generation and teach others and continue to be such a vibrant member of the Canadian poetry scene. Now, Lucia, if anyone wants to find out more about you or see some of your performances or some of your work, where would you like to point them to?
They can either go to my website, so luciadeluca.com, or my Instagram, which is luciadeluca96.
Brilliant. And we'll have links for all of those in the episode description as normal. We're about to hear a third piece before we say goodbye, but I also have another question. This is a new question that we've had on the pod, and it's a lot of responsibility. So I hope you've thought about this. In the interest of the community spirit of spoken word poetry, Lucia, you get to nominate another spoken word artist that I have to invite onto the pod, even if it's intimidating, even if I've never heard of them, and we're going to see if we can make it happen. So have you thought about who you'd like to nominate?
Yes. So I was recently in Launceston and I performed at an open mic called Poetry Peddlers. Yes. And I found out that this event has been running for 39 years.
Wow.
And I know. I've been to a few different cities and checked out the poetry scenes there, and I don't think I've heard of anything over 15. Before going to Poetry Peddlers. And for all 39 years, it has been run by a poet named Marilyn Arnold. And so I'm nominating her because in the spirit of community, she has created such a long-lasting community. And not only have I never heard of a poetry series going for that long. I've also never heard of it being run by the same person for anywhere near that long. So I think that's really impressive. So not only is she a poet, but she's also an organizer. And I think she would have a lot to say if she would like to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. Wow. What a great nomination. 39 years. That is so impressive. I would have so many questions about how you do that, how you invest in a community for that long. I'm sure it hasn't all been smooth sailing and they've had their own lockdowns as well. So I would have a lot of questions for Marilyn. So I will definitely be reaching out to see if they'd like to come on. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm really happy with how this is all going. It's my new favorite thing, just spreading the love a little bit. Lucia de Luca, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for dropping by our little corner of the world and our little corner of the podcasting world. I cannot believe it's your first podcast. I hope it's the first of many for you because I think your work is excellent and I think it deserves to be heard by people from far and wide. So you're going to leave us with one last piece today?
Sure. And I want to give a big thank you to you. This has been a great first podcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I did 2 longer pieces for my first 2, so I think I'll keep it shorter for the last one.
Sure.
So I mentioned earlier, like I have a chronic illness, and a lot of how I approached living with this chronic illness in the past is that I feel like I was living in the anticipation of an emergency that weren't really arising instead of just living and dealing with an emergency if it would ever come up. And the way I had this epiphany that I should change my way of thinking is that life gave me a poem again. And so this is a ridiculous story of something that happened to me. And in the middle of this chaos and this ridiculousness, I realized that my perspective on living with a chronic illness was wrong, at least wrong for me.
Okay.
So here we go. On a Tuesday at 3:04 a.m., the alarm system in my building went off and stopped before I had enough time to put my socks on. This left me confused. Should I finish putting my socks on or go back to bed? Awoken again at 3:12 a.m., I evacuated. Socks on. On Thursday, the same sequence repeated itself at 3:33 and 3:45 a.m. An alarm that couldn't sustain its blare, incapable of deciding if it should stick to yelling fire or admit mistaking a clean breeze for smoke. Less of my neighbors bothered to leave their apartments this time, made lazy by their compounded anger. My partner and I lingered in the lobby, ready to leave if necessary, and could see the fire trucks pull away with their wasted sirens for the second time that week. I considered going back to sleep with my socks on forever, but didn't want my feet to live the rest of their lives as if an alarm was about to go off. The couple next door was furious. My partner was dreading work the next morning, but I just had an epiphany. I can't live my life bracing myself for flare-ups either. I'm healthier when less prepared for an emergency and more prepared for rest. Chronically healing rather than chronically ill. I left my socks on the floor. They've been washed and put away. I don't even recall which pair I was wearing. The alarm hasn't gone off since.
Lucia de Luca, thank you so much for bringing your absolute best to us today and just sharing your passion and your work.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Weetabix hands, what's that all about?